All right. So again, I'd like to say welcome and thank you for participating in this important discussion about Christianity and racism. I also want to introduce my co-host Cassandra Thompson, who's going to help me put this conversation together. So in this discussion, we're going to focus on racial disparities when it comes to policing. We will talk about the racial incidents of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, Daniel Prude, and Ahmaud Arbery, in which they were all harassed by white law enforcement, and some of them, obviously, that were killed. In addition to that, we will discuss the civil unrest that has been happening across the nation. So kind of much was how it has been happening in Rochester, New York, Portland, Oregon, New York City. Obviously, you saw the clashes with Black Lives Matter, and Trump. We're going to talk about that. We're going to dive into that. Also, we're going to look at the disparities about social justice in the Christian church. So I'm going to have Cassandra is going to read the talking points, and then I want to show you a quick video.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the talking points are being Christian and supporting social justice causes has been very controversial for years since the time of Jim Crow era. It is a topic that is talked about heavily in the Black, brown, or progressive churches. However, in white acts, it is non-existent. Many white evangelicals that Black Lives Matter are evil, communist, terrorist, Marxist group trying to destroy the country.
Okay, great.
Yeah, no, it was great. And thank you so much for having me for this conversation. I value this, and I'm really excited to delve in.
Amazing. So let's go ahead and look at this video. You probably saw this video already, but let's go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. All right, so this was off of Sojourners, and then we're going to kind of start our conversation from there.
Do Black Lives matter to white Christians? Because even though we agree on Jesus, we seem divided about his children. 72% of white Christians don't agree that there's a pattern of violence against Black men, but 82% of Black Christians believe the opposite. So why are our perspectives so different? How can a government choke a man to death for selling cigarettes, or imprison a woman for failing to signal, or kill a child in the park and not be held accountable? These are the ones on camera, but what about the countless others that aren't? If we keep saying these moments are isolated, what are we saying about our Black brothers and sisters? They're liars? We don't believe them? It's time for white Christians to start listening. How many more isolated incidents will it take before we all see the pattern? It's time for white Christians to start acting more Christian than white. Join the conversation.
I think this pretty much speaks for itself. But before we start talking about the video, I kind of want to get your take on this, because I've asked this question before in the previous conversation. So when you hear the term Black Lives Matter, what does that mean to you?
To me, when I hear the word Black Lives Matter, I think it is the encompassment of the gospel. It is nothing but Christian. In order to say that, you cannot separate the two. Because to me, if you're saying that all people are made in the image of God, we need to stand against injustice. I loved what the video talked about also too, because it talked about the idea of there are white people that are upholding this idea of whiteness more than they're upholding this idea of Christianity. And it is completely and utterly true. It is devastating. It is sickening. A lot of it started during the time of the 1970s. Even if you go back to Falwell Sr. and Liberty, he was approached by Martin Luther King Jr. and he asked him, he said, look, can you stand beside me? Can you march with us? And Falwell said blatantly, I will separate the gospel from social justice. It has nothing to do with the two. And since that time, people have been more concerned with this white extraction than they have within the gospel of Christ. And for years, we've Americanized and bastardized what Christianity truly is, because there are so many people that are so much more in love with their whiteness, their status, and their power than they are with creating equality and racial justice. So it is a shame of what has happened. And I think for someone to call themselves a Christian and not stand for Black Lives Matter, they're a Pharisee. They cannot claim the name of Christ and not say Black Lives Matter. The two have to go together.
Absolutely. I think what you said is absolutely true. I think that Black Lives Matter definitely goes together. And if you're a Christian and you're too afraid to say that Black Lives Matter, and speaking of Jerry Falwell, that's interesting because I didn't really know that about him, that he was that he separated that civil rights movement from gospel. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about that because I'm going to kind of throw you some quotes here that I have. And kind of that's going to kind of pinpoint us into our very next question that I have for you. So I want to kind of see what you kind of think about this here. So these are some quotes.
Okay.
I'm going to start off with our very good friend, Franklin Graham. This is what he thinks about Black Lives Matter. He says, here are 3 reasons why Black Lives Matter is incompatible with the biblical Christianity. This is what he says, number 1. Black Lives Matter seeks to dismantle the biblical definition of the family. Number 2, Black Lives Matter champions the celebration of homosexuality. Number 3, Black Lives Matter taunts gender confusion as normal and seeks to make heroes of those who are mentally confused. So before I go on to that, I just want to get your thoughts about just Franklin Graham before I read the next one. So just your thoughts. I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
I would dismiss it, but the saddest thing that I find is there are so many people that listen to it. The evangelical culture is about 11 to 13% of people within the whole entire country. Yet they are the ones that have the biggest mouths and the biggest microphones.
Yeah.
So they're controlling the political atmosphere. They're controlling how people perceive, especially Black Lives Matter. And so they're the small minority that is taking up the majority voice. So the first thing that I would say to Franklin Graham is I would completely dismiss it, knowing his character, knowing what he stands for. The second thing that I would say is to me, if someone quoted that to me, I would read them off a list of wonderful authors and books that truly actually exemplified the gospel, were wonderful pastors, were wonderful Christian leaders that actually show that social justice and the gospel go hand in hand.
Exactly. I think that's a very, very good book. And I actually have a whole bunch of couple of books in my package.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So another guy, which is also kind of interesting, is Sean Feucht. You actually pretty much know what we're talking about, right? And Cassandra, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
So we kind of know where he was that gospel guy who kind of goes out, have these little Christian evangelism things out in the, in the open.
Yeah.
And it was kind of interesting because, we're not going to go into a whole back. But there was a couple interesting things that he said about Black Lives Matter. And I'm not going to read, some of it's kind of the same thing that Franklin Graham said. But this is what he said. Has called the Black Lives Movement as shady and a fraud. And this is what he said. He said he supports the statement that Black Lives Matter, but that we can't let our God-given empathy get hijacked by a dark moment with hidden agendas. So this kind of leads me to this next question here. Why is it difficult for Christian conservatives like Franklin Graham and Sean Feucht to support Black Lives Matter? And conservative Christians, we know what we're talking about, Caucasians. And I know that you're a Caucasian yourself, but why is it so difficult for them to support that?
I think also too, I think speaking from, growing up in very multiracial neighborhood, but also dealing with a lot of white churches. there's a lot of worship when it comes to capitalism. And so when they're looking at the Black Lives Movement and they're thinking that it's a Marxist, it's this, it's social justice, it's socialism creeping into their gospel, they don't understand the facets and the beauty of liberation theology. And so when they're looking at the scripture, they're looking at it from such a position of whiteness, from such a position of capitalism and republicanism, and looking at how they can actually take their agenda and then fit it into the Word of God. And really, you can't. It's almost like trying to fit, almost like, this is the word picture that I have. Imagine fitting 200 clowns within a small little clown car. It just doesn't work. And I think the same thing is happening when it comes to this idea of white, quote unquote, Christianity that really has permeated and perverted the gospel in America, because they're trying to fit something that never really fits. And so when you look at white culture, especially within the church, you look at anti-feminism, you look at the inequality, you look at the abuse that goes on towards women, toward people of color, and it's raised up because they can easily say, well, the man is supposed to be the spiritual head. Well, the problem with white culture is it's not the man, it's the white man. And it always has been. And there has been a worship of white maleness within the American church for so many years. And it really has created this idea of oppression. So if you are not a white male in some form, that's the only type of leadership that you can attain to. And so there really is, there's a structure that needs to be taken down when it comes to this white ideology within the church. And a lot of the times I think it's worshiped, it's held up as gospel truth. And there's a lot of eisegesis, or taking apart scripture verses to make it work, where it really never has worked within the context of historic or contextualized within the scriptures.
Wow, that's deep. Wow, that's deep. I think that was the best answer I've heard all day long. And I think this is so sad that, you know, you just can't get them on board, because they just think that the first things that come up is Marxism. They see all the bad things about Black Lives Matter, but they really don't really see the good that comes out of it. And I think that now this is going to be going into the civil unrest part of the conversation, because that's also another part about Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Christianity is about civil unrest.
No, I just wanted to add also too to the with the problem with the white church is this idea of being a missionary. And when you look at the historical significance of being a missionary, a lot of it was about gentrification and colonization. And those two things still ring true so much today. So until we actually come on board with understanding that every single person is equal, approaching different cultures, approaching different races on that equal standard and that racial justice, the white church will always have a problem with oppression. And it will always have a problem with Black Lives Matter, because they've been taught that in order to interact with those that are not white, you colonize and you gentrify.
Right. And you know something, before I actually played a video, because that just actually, you just had point. I think also when you think about missionary, because obviously the first word that comes with the missionary, and I've gone to a lot of Caucasian, I've gone to a lot of churches, you know, that's heavily on missions, but their missions are always overseas. Have you ever noticed that? It's never actually in America. The only time will be if in America there's like a natural disaster, like a Hurricane Katrina or a Hurricane Michael. But when you talk about missionaries, automatically conservative Christianity, that means you're going to another country, you're going over there to somewhere where it's like definitely Africa, which they love to go to, which is a third world country. And it's the same, you know, and they kind of saw me like oppression was there the gospel. I said, that's great, but we also have oppression, third world stuff that's happening here in this country. I said, why don't you solve the problems here instead of trying to go all the way overseas? And they probably saying the same things like, okay, why are you over here? Why don't you just, you have your own human rights problems, and your problems are more deeper than here. Why do you keep on ignoring that? And I think that's a big problem about the conservative church. And I'm glad that you brought that up. Cassandra, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, it's okay. I have a comment about missionaries. I was participating in a missions group in Washington, D.C. This was back in 2008, 2009. And what I did there was I was on a mission trip with my church. So while I was there, I fed the homeless. I stayed at a church. That's where I slept. I was sleeping in a sleeping bag. Like, I couldn't use my cell phone. You know, I couldn't use my cell phone. So, like, I could use it, but it was only in certain times that I could. So I could understand when you were saying about missionaries going to a mission in the United States, because it's true. I had an experience where we had a speaker come in and he was homeless and he talks about his story. And what I did was I sympathized with his story. I told him that, you know, your story really meant a lot to me. And whenever I give to goodwill. And that's what I've always been taught to do. And he said, you know, Cassandra, keep on doing what you're doing because people, they need, you know, they need your goods. So you can donate them however you want. And by doing that, by serving, like, it really, like, tugged at my heart because that's what I've always done. And that's what I will continue to do because there are people that are on the street. Like, I remember I was on the street of Washington, D.C., walking up and down, and I was going to lunch with my missions group. And one of the guys told me, you know, ma'am, you know, could I have some money? You know, I need it because I need food. And I said, I'm sorry, I can't give you anything. They said, okay, you know, I'm sorry. I said, it's all right. You know, but, you know, I wanted to, my heart, but I knew that I couldn't do it at the time. So instead of giving money, I give my clothes. I volunteer at my church's soup kitchen. I do that. Like, I've been doing that since 2007. So it's, you know, it's something that I do to give back to people. And, you know, I'm giving my heart because, you know, the Lord wants us to volunteer, to use our treasures, use our gifts that He's given us. So that's what I do.
That's
yeah,
great.
no, that's awesome.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's great.
And Cassandra, I love the fact that you talked about how you had heard the story from this homeless guy. Like,
Yeah.
you allowed his life to affect you. And I think that's the beauty of, that's what a mission trip should be like, where it's like when you're interacting with people and you're learning as much about them as much as you're pouring out. So that's great. That's really encouraging.
Amazing. That's great. That's a great story to hear. Talk about that. That's an amazing story. All right, so now let's get into this video. We're gonna go into our civil rights conversation here. This was earlier in June.
Now to the fallout from the president's visit to St. John's Episcopal Church just after we were on the air last night here. The Park Police firing flashbangs, smoke canisters, pepper balls at peaceful demonstrators, apparently to clear the way for the president. We have learned it was Attorney General William Barr who gave the order. Tonight, church leaders are now expressing outrage. So are leaders in both parties. And here's our chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl.
As President Trump rode through Washington today, citizens, including families with homemade signs, jeered the presidential limousine. We were in the motorcade watching the people, their signs withering. Are you a moral monster? I can't breathe. Today, outrage is growing over the forceful removal of peaceful protesters to clear the way for the president to hold a photo op at St. John's Church. It all began shortly after 6 p.m., the hour before Washington's curfew took effect. The protesters had gathered just a block from the White House gate. As the president prepared to speak in the Rose Garden, our camera spotted Attorney General Bill Barr surveying the scene. Sources tell ABC News the Attorney General then gave the order to remove the protesters using force. And so it began, continuing even as the president was saying these words.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
You could hear the explosions from the Rose Garden. the police using flashbang, smoke canisters, and pepper balls to force the protesters away. Among those roughed up, an Australian TV crew, the photographer hit in the face, his colleague hit with a baton as she tried to flee. After he was done speaking, the president, accompanied by his top advisors, walked to St. John's Church, crossing the street where the protesters had gathered less than an hour earlier. In front of the church, the president held up a Bible.
Is that your Bible?
It's a Bible.
He summoned his advisors to pose for a photo before heading back to the White House. Among the first to express outrage, the Bishop of Washington, the spiritual leader of Episcopalians in the nation's capital, including the parishioners at St. John's.
But he is not entitled to use the spiritual symbolism of our sacred spaces and our sacred texts to promote or to justify a entirely different message.
The condemnation stretched across the political spectrum, including prominent Republicans.
If your question is, should you use tear gas to clear a path so the president can go have a photo op, the answer is no.
Republican Senator Ben Sasse said, quote, "I'm against clearing out a peaceful protest for a photo op that treats the word of God as a political prop." Even Pat Robertson, prominent televangelist and an ardent supporter of President Trump, had harsh words for the president.
And it seems like now is the time to say, I understand your pain. I want to comfort you. I think it's time we love each other. But the president took a different course.
Robertson lambasted the president for threatening to move military troops into American cities unless the nation's governors control the violence.
Matter of fact, he spoke of them as being jerks. You just don't do that, Mr. President. It isn't cool.
So let's get to John Carl back with us again tonight from the White House. John, I know you were in the motorcade today witnessing those protesters, their signs. The president, though, unwavering on this tonight. And also this evening, a former president now weighing in, John?
Former President George W. Bush out with a powerful statement that condemns the, quote, brutal suffocation of George Floyd and says many doubt the justice of our country, and with good reason. President Bush does not mention President Trump by name, but he does express support for the protesters, saying, quote, "Those who set out to silence those voices do not understand the meaning of America or how it becomes a better place." That's President George W. Bush tonight, David.
All right, John Carl, thank you again for this.
Wow. Let's just, that's a lot to unpack right there. I mean, you see even Republicans, even Pat Robertson was his main, that was his main supporter. And even he was saying, wait, no, you can't do that. So just on that, I'm gonna kind of go a little different direction here. What do you think? Because obviously there actually are some supporters out there, and this is actually from the New York Times, and it says, this is what one person said: "To me, it was like, that's great. Trump is recognizing the Bible. We are one nation under God," Mr. Skolton said. "He is willing to stand out there and take a picture of it for the country to see." So, go ahead.
I think there are so many things wrong with what the president did. I think, one, the fact of using the Bible as a prop. I definitely agreed with the Episcopalian bishop right there. And I loved what she said. I think the other is the false idea that we are a Christian nation. We are not a Christian nation. The idea of separation of church and state was not for the state's benefit. It wasn't for the church's benefit. It was for the state's benefit. We left England in order to actually become a place for diversified faith. Not just one faith, but diversified faith and freedom for all faiths or non-faiths community. This idea that the president had is idealistic and is non-historical. And so I think that's part of the problem. But the fact that he thought that it was completely legitimate to brutalize people in order to get a photo op just shows the lack of his understanding of Christianity. and the lack of understanding of ethics. You cannot claim to be a Christian moralist and have that much disrespect for people in order to have just a photo op in front of a church.
Yeah, that's just completely just crazy. I mean, now let's take it a little step further, because obviously as these protests goes on, this is just one example of a protest, but I mean, the fact that he says that I am the preacher, the guy of law and order, and the fact that now he was going to send the National Guard out there, like he called in his so-called Democrat cities, where he said he was going to just use these people just to restore order. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? Because I mean, yeah, what are your takes?
Look at the idea of Sean Foyt, for instance. He caused an uproar. They just did a back and forth, newsreel on. You look at Washington Square Park. One day ago, he had thousands. The last one that he had in Sacramento, he boasted about how he had 12,000 people show up in full worship to God. He's doing this specifically in Democrat cities because he's calling for the doors to be open and let us worship. He's a white man getting away with white privilege. I don't see the president calling the National Guard to break up that union. What I do see is the president bringing in National Guard to make sure that certain people groups are subjugated and oppressed. And that is where I have my issue. To me, when he says that he is a president creating law and order, he is creating law and order because he believes that certain people groups should be subjugated and oppressed more than others. And that, I think, is the real meat of the sickening of the whole situation. I mean, even when he talks about the idea of diversity and inclusion training, he calls that anti-American. That should be American. I mean, the idea that every single person within this amazing country should have respect, should have equal rights, should have human decency, that should not be debatable as un-American or unpatriotic. That is America.
Right.
And to me, when he claims law and order, he's not having law and order for all Americans. He's having law and order so that whites live at a higher status and have more power than any other people group within this country.
Wow. I think I took a lot out of there. I think that if you just look at it, I just like the way how you explained it, because you explained the part where they were saying that there's a difference. I like how you used the part where you had Sean Foyt, who's having these worship services in these Democratic cities, and he's not calling no cops. He's not calling no National Guard. They said, "Oh, hey, it's okay. Do whatever you want. Do whatever you want to do." But yet we can't protest. We can just sit there and say, "Oh, wait, no, they're wrong." And then to add fuel to the fire, you have these Trump supporters that come out of these places, these small little towns. They come in like in Portland, and then as you can see, there was that death with one of the persons who we just shot the person to death. He won't speak about that. So you're talking about Christianity, and this is what I just don't understand, is that why do white Christians support Donald Trump, who was the complete opposite of a Christian? And to me, I just don't understand. I mean, can you explain that one, Cassandra?
Yeah.
Yes. I think the reason why they support Donald Trump is because that's what they've been taught since they were little. It's about what you learned when you were little growing up. My mom taught me to vote this way because this is how I've been raised. And this is how I registered to vote. I voted this way. This is how I feel. But I don't understand why people get upset about unemployment and taxes and things like that. They want things to change, but then they voted for a certain person. They're voting for they vote for what their parents taught them.
Right.
They don't vote for what I think is right. Who am I following? They don't vote consciously in their mind. They don't think, oh, I should vote for this person because this is what I believe. This is what I think that this guy or this girl can do. So that's what I think.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I would even just kind of jump a little bit on what you're saying, is this idea of, especially being raised, how do I put it? So when being raised in a white church as a female, you are raised with two expectations. You get married, you get pregnant. That's it. And so because of that, there's no form of leadership, there's no opportunities, there's no other road or any other pathway except those two ideologies. Now, because of that, the pro-birth or pro-fetus is so ingrained within white cultural churches. The problem is there are too many churches out there that claim pro-life. They're not pro-life, they're pro-birth. They're anti-life, because you don't see these same churches offering equality. You don't see the same churches marching in Black Lives Matter protests. If they were truly pro-life, they would be pro-life from the born to the death, but they're not. They're pro-convenience. And I think the other thing that I would say is, you look at Sean Foyt right now, and this idea of whites have been taught this idea of, oh, we're part of the persecuted church. Whites believe that any type of inconvenience is injustice. It is not. It is an inconvenience. I think the biggest frustration that I have within that type of culture and community is they need to understand what injustice truly is. Because I think if they were, we would be standing next to our Black brothers and sisters, because we would understand what true injustice was. But because they're so used to being inconvenienced and they want that power, they want that structuralism, they're not willing to look beyond it. So it's this idea of capitalism. And if anything, Christianity has been very much steeped in capitalism and almost to the point of dictatorship. So where the only voice, the only hierarchy that matters is whiteness. So, and things need to change. They need to change for the better.
It does. I agree. I think
I agree. They do.
I absolutely agree with that 100%. I think that, you just see it all the time. I think the way of how you just said it is just that the white church is just so laser focused on two things, because they're used to the old traditional way of how to do things. They're not the LGBTQ. They actually probably the most, I won't say inclusive, let's use the word exclusive, because they just exclude, the only people that are there are people that support their so-called abortion. They don't want no abortion. They want to make sure you protect the room. But again, it's a woman's right to choose. I used to think the same way, but over time, my opinion has changed. They don't support LGBTQ. They think that they're crazy people, that they strongly believe that there needs to be a man and a woman, which it's in the biblical time, but we're in the year 2020. So this is 2020. It's a different time. You have to adjust. Love is love. So I mean, they basically are people that basically don't even read they say they so-called know the Bible, but they just don't read it because they just don't practice it. Everything that they say, I mean, and I'm sorry for going a little off here, is that I was in a conversation with one person. I'm going to keep the person anonymous, and he was a big, huge supporter of Donald Trump. And I was trying to tell him all the ills, the races. I was telling him he was a racist, he's a sexist. He doesn't support Black Lives Matter. He wants to use harm to get at protesters. And some of the conversations that he had, he's a white conservative, and I didn't know that he was that conservative up until I listened to it. And I just listened to his text messages, and he was saying that, well, that Black Lives Matter. It's like what Franklin Graham said, they were evil, they're Marxists. I agree with everything that Trump has to say, that, these Democrat cities are the ones that kind of, that, he will never ever go in again, is because they kind of need, Trump just wants to bring law and order. So when I have to correct them every single point, he was saying, oh, now you're using moral judgment. I'm like, what? I was like, what? I said, no, that's not moral judgment. I'm just telling you the truth. Mm-hmm. I said, y'all judged Obama for 8 years. Mm-hmm. And we had to tell you, chill out on that. I said, that's not true. Yeah, so all of a sudden, it's okay for you to criticize a Black person, but yet we can't criticize Trump, because now it's, oh, well, you're making a moral judgment. Yes, I disagree with some of the things, but he has made this country better. I'm like, for you, but not for me. And anybody that disrespects Black Lives Matter and calls civil unrest terrorist groups, I have a problem with. And on fact of that, I'm also a member of the NAACP Parkchester branch. So now you're calling my organization a terrorist group? No. We have a problem. So after that, I just stopped talking. I said, I can't. So those are the things that we're up against. I mean, you can see it. I mean, conservatism is something that is just so.
I agree. I have a comment on that. With let's see. Oh, yes. With the two different parties, they believe two different things.
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with a friend who lives her life differently. She said to me that the group that I vote for believes in abortion. I don't believe in abortion. But this is what this person said. That this person is wrong because not a lot of people who vote in my group think that abortion is right. I believe in pro-life.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in that. I don't believe in not having life.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I think it's a great point because it leads to the idea of where people have so many assumptions. And it's like as soon as they find out your political party, it's like they automatically paste it as, oh, okay, you believe in this, 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 and this.
Right.
And, you know, we're individuals. We believe in, you know, more so than other things. And, you know, I mean, I'm not 100% with every single thing that my party believes.
Yeah.
You know, however, I believe in the majority. And so I believe that it will create equality and create equal standing for more people than just a small minority. So, you know, but yeah, you make a great point.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. So I just have two more follow-up questions for you. This is now on involvement because I think that's kind of like the big key. That's like the only way that we're going to kind of put this whole thing together. So as a Christian body, as now we're talking the entire Christian body, not just one, but everybody, progressive, conservative, if we ever get to that point, how can we support social justice? I'm going to take the word Black Lives Matter out just for the moment, but you kind of understand what I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I was thinking through this question and I came up with two words. So it's a two-step process. The first part, I would say it's changing your ideology. And so that comes with reading. It comes from understanding, delving into conversations like this, where you're challenging yourself and saying, look, I'm coming in as a learner. I'm coming in to be teachable and just to grasp something and to just be fed. Because I think a lot of the times, especially within white culture, we have to break this idea of being a missionary. We have to break this idea of being a teacher and just place ourselves in the seat of learning. And that I would say there's TED Talks, there's books, you know, pray. There's so many Christians out there. Pray that you would be teachable. Pray that actually God would give you a teachable heart. So two books that I would recommend is The Color of Compromise by Jabbar Tisby. And it's also backed up by Lecrae. So I would say this is a really good book, especially for conservatives to start out with, because you will find a lot of things that you can agree with and that you can really resonate with. The second one that I would recommend is it's actually called Rescuing the Gospel from the Cowboys. And as you can see, I've got a lot, but it actually is a Native American expression of the Jesus way. And it is brilliant. It talks about how American Christianity especially has changed over the years and how it's been infiltrated and overshadowed by a lot of cultural nuances that have come into play that have nothing to do with Jesus. And so it really gives you a chance to rip away a lot of the stuff that's overshadowed what the gospel truly is. The second, I would say, is you go from ideology to changing your implementation. And so one of the things that I find, especially within a lot of progressive churches and a lot of, you know, white progressive churches, is they're the first ones to march in the march, but they're the last ones to actually do anything.
Right.
And so I would ask them, what do your policies say about harassment, discriminations? My thinking is every single membership class of the church should include an anti-discrimination program and a diversity and inclusion educational program, so that when you are meeting as the body of believers, you're holding each other to the same standard of respect. And so that you're creating an environment and a culture that truly is communal, that truly actually stems from racial justice. And so I would say it has to start with that. I would say also too, look at your board, look at your pastoral staff. You cannot speak this idea of social justice without rearranging your leadership structure. Yes. And so these things are big. These things are big because you have to put your money where your mouth is. It has to be a change. And so those would be the two things that I would suggest, where it's like, if you're looking to start with learning. If you're looking to actually implement change, ask people around the table and put yourself in a learner's seat and say, what needs to change in my policies? How do I actually create a voice that is not just solely white within my church, within my organization? And make sure that your policies are equal for every single race and every single person group.
That's very well said. I think I got a lot of nuggets out of that. I think that, just that's the best way of how we can kind of bridge that gap together, bringing the white church. And I think also, white church also have to look at their own racism as well. That's going to be very hard. Just for them just to admit racism and kind of just invite that in and just say, even just saying the words Black Lives Matter is important. If you can say that, like, I know, and it's a hard thing to get them to say that. And I think that it's kind of important is that, just say the words Black Lives Matter. Yeah. If you can say that, then you can bring them into your church. Just because at this moment, there's just so much hurt that's going on. And I think that if you just look at it, if you just look at just what's been going on I think George Floyd must have been the straw that broke the back. And just seeing just that anger. And I have to tell people all the time, I said, no. I said, the reason they're that way is because they're hurting. And now is a time that as church, especially the conservative church, is that you need to open those doors. Yes, you talk about the message of Jesus Christ. I said, yeah, that's great. I said, but they don't want to hear that right now. I said, the words that they want to hear right now is what is going to bring justice back to all those people that were killed. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, list goes on and on. I said, unless you can provide an answer for that, then you're not going to get them in the door.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think a lot of the times, you look at the conservative churches and they're so concentrated on, well, I've been saved from this. But what have you been saved for? And that's where the responsibility comes upon us to say, well, what am I called here for? What's my purpose? How can I actually bring heaven to earth in some way so that I can be that little Christ that people see? And it requires responsibility. And I think, as you said, it requires the idea of, if you can't look in the mirror and understand that, especially within white culture, you can't label yourself as having hidden biases. You can't label yourself as having racial issues. You're not going to change, because you need to acknowledge the problem before you can actually move forward.
Exactly. I think the next question I'm not even going to bother asking. I think we just thanks to everyone. Thank you, Colleen, for participating in this important conversation. We hope that you have felt inspired and motivated to join this pivotal social justice movement. As if your friends, family, or church aren't involved, convince them to be. God calls all of us to be proactive in the fight. We need everyone to be lockstep. If we are not lockstep into making changes, then things are going to remain the same. This isn't going to be the last conversation. There will be plenty more of these discussions in the near future. So again, I just want to say thank you all, and we'll see you guys next time.